Started to clean up. Just tell me what you're I haven't done my taxes yet. Something but I forget. You know I am under this rug. I haven't done my taxes yet. There's something to but I forget. Welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few moments. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening/afternoon. We're so pleased to discuss this book today with the wonderful author Nikita Lalwani and our guest Rebekah Entralgo. Thank you so much. I'll tell you a little bit about who we have here and what's going on tonight. Firstly, for anyone who is new, we are Lost City Books. We are an independent bookstore in the heart of Adams Morgan. So if you've ever traipsed down 18th Street, you'll know where we are. We specialize in used, new, and rare books. And our new space, which you might know we remodeled in early 2020, generates engagement and enrichment from the surrounding community. We invite artists, activists, organizers, authors, and educators from the area to share their knowledge and skills. And if you know our staff, you'll know that many of us are also artists, authors, organizers, activists, etc. I'm your host for tonight. My name is Shady Rose, and I'm so pleased to be here. Nikita Lalwani is a novelist born in Kota, Rajasthan, and raised in Cardiff, Wales. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a judge for the 2020 Rathbones Folio Prize for Literature. Her work has been translated into 16 languages. You People, her third novel, which we're here to discuss today, was published on the 2nd of April, 2020. She's a contributing screenwriter on a television series for BBC One/Amazon Studios, Big Talk Productions, to be broadcast in 2020. I'd like to hear a bit more about that series as well, if we have a few seconds. Rebekah Entralgo is a writer, editor, and advocate for undocumented workers. She currently serves as the managing editor of inequality.org and previously covered immigration and labor as a reporter at Think Progress. A longtime advocate for immigrant rights, she led communications and media strategy at Freedom for Immigrants, a national nonprofit working to abolish immigration detention. Rebekah holds a Bachelor of Arts in Editing, Writing, and Media from Florida State University, where she was an undergraduate research assistant studying growing activist movements on social media. And a little bit about You People, the book that we're discussing today. The Pizzeria Vesuvio looks like any other Italian restaurant in London, with a few small differences. The chefs who make the pizza fiorentinas are Sri Lankan, and half the kitchen staff are illegal immigrants. At the center is Tuli, the restaurant's charismatic proprietor and resident Robin Hood, who promises to help anyone in need. Welsh 19-year-old Mia, haunted by her troubled past, is running from her family. Shan, having fled the Sri Lankan civil war, is desperate to find his. But when Tuli's guidance leads them all into dangerous territory and the extent of his mysterious operation unravels, each is faced with an impossible moral choice. In a world where the law is against you, how far would you be willing to lie for a chance to live? I think that's a really good question, and I'd like to open the discussion. Hi, hello everyone.
Hi everyone.
Thanks very much, Shady.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I would love, Nikita, if you would sort of expand on that last question that was part of the blurb and maybe tell us a little bit more about You People and how it came to be.
Oh, thanks so much. So, yeah, that question, are you willing to lie? I guess is at the heart of You People, where I think that question was the reason I wrote the book. So, when I sit down to write fiction, I tend to put together something that will start me off in order to answer a question that I can't answer directly, and it might take me a few years to try and answer it. And that question is when should we intervene? When can we make moral choices for others? When is it important to intervene? I guess. Say, for example, if the government of the country you're living in is failing you and not providing you with your basic needs, then do we, as bystanders, have a job? Is it important for us to intervene, even if that means lying? And the concept of a lie and what a lie is, it's a bit like a secret, the idea of a secret, something that somebody somewhere doesn't want known. A lie is an untruth, but can it highlight a greater truth? In the book, there's a question around lying over one's own experience. One of the characters who you already mentioned, Shan, in the restaurant, he's there because he's fleeing the Sri Lankan war and it's a place of refuge for him. And there's a big question over whether he needs to lie in order to tell the truth, because the truth of his own experience and his own trauma isn't coming across and it's not helping him gain sanctuary. So does he need to lie in order to get to the truth, which is that he does definitely need sanctuary and he does definitely need to find the wife and child that he's lost? So I guess that line at the end of the book is very important, and it's very much part of the reason that I started trying to write the book. And by the end, I guess the book is some sort of attempt to answer it.
Thank you. Yeah, something that I would love for you to expand on a bit is you mentioned the word sanctuary a moment ago, and I know that a large part of the book is about how these characters are interacting with the law and how the law is kind of made, um, I guess, to harm them or made against them in a way. And I would like, I think, and Rebekah, you probably have some insights on this as well. I would like to hear a bit more about that, about what that sanctuary means when the other laws, are working against the safety and well-being of these characters and of the people.
Yeah, so I mean, in the book, the restaurant is partly modelled on a real life place that I used to frequent in South London, where you could go. It was known that you could go to this pizzeria, which was populated by immigrants, both legal and those who were considered illegal, from various walks of life. So you had Sri Lankan cooks in the back, and then you had the front of house where you've got the European waitresses, and then upstairs all kinds of deals are being done under the table. And the restaurant was known to be a place that you could go if you needed help. So that help might be legal aid, it might be cash, it might be a loan, it might be a job, it might be dental work, or the ability to set up, a couch to sleep on. Somebody somewhere who's linked to the restaurant might be able to provide you with somewhere to sleep. It was a sort of really fascinating place, and at the centre there was this character who was a little bit like Tuli in the book, in that he made decisions and also gave legal aid freely to those who needed it. So in a sense, he was sort of running a kind of Solomon's court up there, where there's not enough in the pot to go round for everyone, obviously. There's a limit to the cash or the resources, just like there is in any sort of local council, I guess. But so decisions need to be made as to whose story is worth it, whose story is authentic, whose story is most accurate. And there's also a level of hubris in playing God in that way. There's a level of sort of arrogance, you might call it, or confidence, or any activism of that kind would require a belief in oneself. And the book asks the question, what happens if something like that goes wrong? It has to go wrong. When there are that many people teeming in one place with that many needs, it can't all go right. And I guess that's the novelistic way to go down that road.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciated that detail about in the book about, sort of the men sort of feeling like they have to, make sure their stories are correct every single time that they retell it. And I think that's something that is very specific and very realistic. I don't think a lot of people really realize that when you are, going through the asylum process, that your story has to be told word for word, basically pretty much every single time, or else you risk not being, qualified for asylum. And a lot of what people go through on their journeys in their home countries is really, really traumatic, and trauma impacts the memory in a lot of ways. And that definitely has an impact, can have an impact on their future down the line. And I haven't really seen that, really explored in the fiction context before. And it's also very interesting, to think about it in the context of what qualifies as a story that's worth gaining asylum. For example, you have to fit in a certain box. You have to be, you have to experience some type of trauma in that way. It's valid and worthy of you getting this, precious legal status. And if you don't, then, that's kind of, you're sort of, fend for yourself in a lot of ways and figure it out on your own. And yeah, I appreciated you bringing that up, because I don't think that's really been a dynamic that's been kind of explored. And I don't think that's something that a lot of people really recognize about the way, both the system in the US and the system in the UK are currently set up. And, they place a premium on certain stories. And I don't think it's really explored on what impact that has.
Yeah, I guess when one of the things I thought about when I was writing the book, because I talked to some asylum lawyers here in the UK, in order to start the sort of getting the observational detail. And there are a couple of things. First of all, how, as a writer even, or as somebody, even if we, try and recount our own experiences, even if we tell an anecdote when you hang out with friends, how often can any of us tell the same story with exactly the same detail each time? It's virtually impossible. You might highlight certain details, but I, for one, can never kind of guarantee that it's going to be, I can't kind of use the same parameters for my own storytelling. And so those holes are very deadly. They're deadly in the restaurant. So they live in fear. The Sri Lankan cooks are all who are making the pizzas in the back. They are all sleeping in one place together. Most of them are, and they all sleep in sort of 2 rooms above the restaurant. And that their dream is to have their own pizzeria, that they'll sort of get a franchise, that they'll own one place together and they'll work there together. And so it's quite a big dream for them. And constantly they hear stories about those who didn't tell their story correctly in court or on the forms. They find filling out the forms very difficult. Um, or those who are so racked by trauma, or whose sisters or partners or people in their circles who are so kind of eaten away, as you say, by trauma that their memories are screwed up. And they can't, one of the big things at the heart of the novel is that Shan can't remember the mobile number of, or the phone number of his wife, because it was always in his phone, which was taken away when he came over illegally. It was put into a big plastic bag on the boat, along with tons of other phones. So in that sense, memory is critical. It's not just a sort of idealistic or hypothetical thing in the book. Being able to remember is everything. It's the difference between surviving and not, I guess, a lot of the time. For him to be able to find the family he's been separated from, he would have to remember things, and he at the start of the book he can't, and he gradually starts trying to remember enough to find them.
Something that comes to mind is the connection of memory being sort of an inalienable human quality, you know, being allowed to transform and grow in your memories. And, you know, part of life is that transformation. And then kind of mirroring that with how these characters and the immigration process in general sometimes will wipe those memories away, and in some small sense can seem to wipe some part of their humanity away as they're processed through this system and this engine that kind of boxes them in and grinds them down in a way. I'd like to hear a bit more about sort of sort of maybe the emotional journeys of these characters as they're encountering these sort of they're facing this treatment of their memory and of their story. Which, does that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In So the restaurant is this place where you can go to be seen, as it were, and you've got somebody who looks like she's Italian, but she's a main character, Nia, who's half Indian, half Welsh, and has grown up in Newport in Wales. And because she looks like she might be Italian, she gets the job of being waitress at the front of the house. So what you seem is not necessarily what you are. You might be passing without realizing it. Um, there's a waitress who appears to be Spanish and legal, but who might actually be neither of those things. Um, but because she's white in the situation of mixed races, she has a certain or there's a certain aura around her in the restaurant, and that's part of the suspense and one of the kind of unfolding narratives of the book. And so there's a lot going on in terms of different kinds of ways, different characters who've been eaten away at by this process of immigration, or of feeling like you don't belong somewhere, or trying to find a home. And the restaurant sort of becomes that home for everyone in it, as it's a temporary form of asylum, whether you're legally there, or whether it's functioning as a kind of safe house for those who are unnumbered. And that was very important to me, that those who are legal are rubbing up against and living with, working with, helping those who are not, in the restaurant. That there's sort of many different ways. There's a Georgian waitress who hangs out there, who comes from down the road. And there are various other people who have come from different countries who live and work on the street, in the halal butchers next door. There's the homeless guys who come around for free pizza. There's a pimp who's Irish, who turns up late at night for free pizza, or to play chess with the owner. So that melting pot of London, and all, in spite of the pain of the various ways in which you might feel excluded, the idea that there is a place where, for a while, for a few hours, or if it's your job, every day, time can pause and you can stop thinking or stop remembering. Or for those who have PTSD or at the restaurant, who have post-traumatic stress disorder, when they leave the restaurant, like Shan, the character we've been talking about, he's just assailed by the memories of the war he's come from and the loss and the guilt. There's quite a lot of guilt in the restaurant for having survived or for having reached another country and not necessarily being with your child or your partner.
Yeah, going off the point of guilt, since I don't know if it was mentioned before, but obviously the book is told from two different perspectives. And as I was starting the book, I was like really at the beginning, really struggling to see the connection of these two different perspectives. One of Nia, you mentioned the passing woman who works at the front, and of Shan, the character you mentioned before. I was really trying to make the connection of how their stories are linked, and can tell this one story with these two competing perspectives. And it's really interesting to come at it from the realization that these are two people who, have really chosen to save themselves and are really grappling with the guilt of that. And I ultimately found that comparison to be really helpful because oftentimes, people who are immigrants are really dehumanized and we're made to feel by the media, by our governments, as though we can't relate to, these people, not to play off the title, but, pitting two separate people or two groups of people against one another. But when we drill down to very essential core human emotions like guilt, we can find a lot of similarities with people who we don't think we have anything in common with. And that kind of bridge building is really, really, essential if we really want to make any sort of meaningful change. And I think having a book set where there's so many people have different varying forms of legal status, different varying backgrounds is really, helpful to view through that lens of, collectivism and drilling down to the most core human emotions and working together in that collective spirit.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a connection, as you rightly point out, Rebecca, that there's a connection that's made because of their guilt, and it's also because of their vulnerability. So even though everyone has to work and everyone has to be professional, I mean, there's an element of performance in the restaurant that's required as part of the job. You're a waitress or a waiter at the front, then you're part of the entertainment for the big table that have come in for their Saturday night out. And you're in the kitchen, you are supposed to, you've got to get the job done. You've got to be working fast. There's a kind of theatre to the whole process. And yet there's a vulnerability in each and every one of these stories. And what unites the two protagonists later on is that vulnerability. So Nia finds herself in a compromising position. She runs back to the restaurant and she is very vulnerable. And in that moment of vulnerability and exposure and not having actual family who, blood relations in the city, she turns to Shan, who happens to be in the restaurant, and the reserve is down, the guard is down, and everything pours out, and he talks openly about his own relationship to those he left behind or what he's doing in the restaurant. And there's something very attractive to me, and then Nia gets sucked into Shan's story, which becomes quite dominant in the second half of the book, and yet she's sort of going on her own journey. And one of the things she's trying to do is work out whether what's happening in the restaurant is right or not. Is Tuli a good person or not? I guess is one of the big questions for her. She says she wants to spread sunlight, not darkness. She's 19 and she's trying to figure out who she is on that front. So, yeah, sorry.
I think an interesting question, kind of related to what you're saying here too, is the experience of having your world sort of narrowed down into this very small, um, ex, this small experience, ostensibly for your own safety, and then from within that small circle of people, small, space, living space, which is ostensibly the safe place, suddenly it's beginning to distrust even those within that circle.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in sort of how that emotional turn of wondering, is Tulio a good person or not? Am I in the right place to spread light and love as I should be?
Yeah.
I'd just love to hear some more thoughts on that as well.
Well, trust is a very important thing in the restaurant, which, as you say, is broken. And that's, in a sense, the wall that they go through. It's like a window pane being shattered, you know. Um, the characters are all, I guess, they're sort of looking through a window at the world from the restaurant, and that's shattered through the breaking of trust. That is a plot spoiler that occurs um, in the book. And in that moment, Tuli himself appears very vulnerable because he himself didn't know that such a thing could happen. And his own ego is damaged because, like all sort of great leaders, he has a measure of ego in play, or he has a measure of confidence or assertiveness that's going on. And he prides himself on being somebody that everyone could turn to, everyone could confess to. He doesn't really believe that anyone might withhold anything from him. Just like, I guess, in a mafia situation, or in the police force, say, there's a desire to believe that you would always, anyone you're working with in that situation would reveal everything, that nothing would be withheld. Otherwise, how can you do things like make sure you can defend them when the police come knocking, when the immigration police come, or when the law comes knocking? How can you prevent someone from being deported if they haven't told you everything? And of course, as Rebecca's already pointed out, it's not that easy to tell to, when you're vulnerable and when you've come over and when you've got 50,000 pieces of your story has been fractured into 50,000 pieces by the trauma of your journey. It's not that easy to tell everyone everything, A, because you might not remember it, or B, because you might not want to endanger the person you're telling, because telling them the truth puts them in danger. Are they duty bound to give you up if they know everything? And also, the less people, the fewer people who know everything, the safer you feel, the less likely the secret will out. And so trust is this very interesting elastic thing in the book. Can Tuli bounce back when trust is broken? Can he get over his own feeling or his own kind of God complex that he has? Um, how does someone like that feel when you cross them, even if they are a kind of Robin Hood character, redistributing wealth and doing as they see fit? How does someone like that feel when trust is broken? But equally, there's a lot of trust in the restaurant that really works out. And that's part of Tuli's, I guess, point at the end when Nia says, you know, some of what's happening here is horrifically dangerous. Some of it isn't, it's very benign. People can turn up with their friends for a free pizza and a glass of wine, or for some legal aid that we all agree they need. But some of the things that are happening are deadly dangerous. Some of the people hanging out here. There's a dealer who comes to the restaurant, a drug dealer who's rumored to have sent a hitman after somebody. There is people smuggling that is going on. Some of it and some of the people associated with those things are incredibly dangerous, and you can't control each link in the chain of command. So you might feel that you're honourable, but if you're smuggling someone over, they're coming over with all kinds of characters from different backgrounds, who may be operating for their own particular needs and their own particular with their own particular agendas. And so she says, what what are you going to do now? I mean, how can you do something that's so dangerous sometimes? And he says, well, it's every now and then you'll make a mistake, but isn't it better than not trying? Think of all the good you can do if you just try. But every now and then there will be a mistake. And that's a kind of messy feeling, I think, in the book around trust and coming back to that idea of taking the law into your own hands. A lot of the time, you can do some really great work by doing that, and every now and then, you'll naturally trip up.
Yeah, I've definitely appreciated a lot of the sort of like messiness that we mentioned, ethical ambiguity of a lot of the characters, because it's really realistic. No one's perfect. We all have, many layers and dimensions to us. But also, I think a lot of times with stories about immigrant communities, I think there's a desire to, uplift the stories of what we see as like the perfect victims. My job for a while was like fielding calls from reporters who are interested in writing stories about immigration. And I can't say, how many times I got a call from someone who was like, hi, I want to talk to someone who was a victim of human trafficking, who has no criminal history, who is from this particular country. And I need to talk to them within 24 hours of my deadline or something like that. Yeah. And they had no interest in talking to anyone with a criminal history or anyone with sort of like a seedier background. And it really just had an impact on me thinking about how many people's stories were just not getting told because of our like emphasis to really want to uplift certain narratives and people who are seen as these perfect victims. I remember I was taking a call from a detention center here in the US and just talking with someone who really wanted to get their story out, and they said to me flat out, like, I don't think anyone's going to be interested in what I have to say, because the minute I tell them my story, they're just going to have these assumptions about me. So I think that's why it's important to have these sort of stories that have these really, multi-dimensional characters that are flawed, that we have questions about their motives. We have questions, about, the way they operate, what their intentions are, just because that's just how people are in real life. And it's important to, translate that into fiction as well.
Yeah, that's very important. Because also in the book, it's a way of putting the reader into that real life position of making a decision. It's essentially about the greater good. So, our Tuli at one point plays a game. He plays a game of rock paper scissors, and the game where you decide what to do. With the three different possible outcomes. And he says, is it better to tell an untruth, to tell a lie, and to end up with the outcome that you want, that is right, that is the outcome that should be? And is that okay for the greater good? Is his general approach. And so that messiness is very important, because that felt to me, from what I was hearing or from what I saw, to be far more of a real world situation. Just the very act of coming over illegally means that you are making a particular decision and hoping for the best. And the reason that Shan doesn't bring his wife and child over, because he knows it's dangerous. He knows he might not make it. He knows that boat might not reach there, and he refuses to put them into that kind of danger. And he knows it's ethically compromised, the whole thing, and he wouldn't be able to forgive himself if something happened to his child and his wife. But once he reaches, he's in this situation where he doesn't know how to find them. And so the whole reason for coming hangs in the balance. And then he himself gets involved in working for Tuli, and being compromised in one way leads to being compromised in another. But as with this other characters in the restaurant who are working with Tuli, they're all carrying this idea of the greater good. So if I can just get by, if I can just do this, if I can just do this next step, then maybe the big, pure thing of a family reunion or of helping somebody who's really in need will take place. But for Nia, it's very complicated at times. So there's a person who comes to the restaurant. They call him the Hungarian, um, just with a capital H. That's his name. He's not named by any of them. He's just simply known as that. And he's being Tuli's defending him in court and giving him legal aid. And there's a question over whether or not he's hit his wife. And he reveals that he has hit her once and only the once. But the question comes up as to whether he's done it again. And Nia is constantly tortured by this question because she feels that if she understands whether he's done that again, then she'll understand something more about everything that Tuli's doing. If he decides to defend someone who's done that, does that mean that everything else he's doing can also be questioned? She keeps trying to create a sort of net that can encase the restaurant and make it make sense. Whereas actually it's this kind of mashup of all of these different lives and different requirements at any one point in time, I guess.
Thank you. Yes, I think the character of Nia having these ponderings about sort of the higher moral quandaries between the characters and within the environment of the restaurant kind of acts as a mirror or as a reflection of kind of the how these moral quandaries do apply to the grander sort of state versions of these what these characters might maybe not entirely represent, but can be allegorical for. Um, and as we're talking about sort of the functions of fiction as characters can represent not just emotional encounters for each other, but also can represent larger forces. I'm curious in your thoughts on how, maybe if you have insider scoop about what some of these characters represent as a larger force, or how they might be allegorical for some of the larger forces that are also at play.
Well, Tuli himself is a Catholic, and so he's working with somebody from the church. He's working with a priest who he's very close to from the church, and they talk about parables themselves because, in a sense, they're working with church money or with church funds and with the I guess the resources that the church can bring to the local community, and then they're doing what they think best, what they think might be best with it, and the priest that he works with will endorse somebody as being a good citizen if he thinks it's right. Again, thinking about the outcome, which is that they might be able to stay in the country, which he believes to be right. So they're sort of they're shrouded in that stuff, and it's very malleable for them. They're not sort of Catholics who are going around trying to convert them. There's a joke that Tuli has early on in the book where Nia is who's come from Wales and from a particularly difficult home life. She's an emigre from Wales. She's come across the border into England from Wales, and that's her migration, I guess. And she's left a home where there's a mother who's an alcoholic and a sister who she feels very guilty about leaving behind, but who's too young to travel with her. Sorry. And Nia says, "Oh, sometimes I'm going through such a long dark night of the soul." You know, she asks him to convert her to Christianity. She was grown up in a kind of atheist household, or quite a hippie household, but one that's gone off the rails, living in the equivalent of the projects in Newport, and with a single mom who makes a lot of demands on her two daughters. And he says, well, are you mad? You know, I would never convert you and sort of keep your scalp, attach your scalp to my satchel and walk off with it into the sunset. I mean, that's insane. But he also says, when you've got that Hindu blood in you running through your veins, why wouldn't you turn to that? You know, there's so much there in a sense. There's so much richness, and it's all the same spiritually. And she finds that quite funny because she's grown up with her Welsh mum, and she has an absent father near. And it's just one part of the kind of racial puzzle that will sort of come together for her as the book moves on, to the point where she can talk to Shan about the fact that she is of mixed race, a mixed heritage. So, and also in terms of sort of mythology, Tuli himself is kind of like a mythic figure in the restaurant. He is a bit like the Godfather, but he also has a sort of Christ-like quality at times, which he's sort of disabused of that side. And so I guess there is a strong sense of I guess not quite the supernatural, but the idea that, you know, things that are out of the ordinary could happen in this restaurant, or that, you know, the seen world or the visible world or the tangible world is not all, I guess. That there's something else in the ether of the London we're seeing, and that, you know, no one way is the only way, no one spiritual path, or possibly Tuli would say, you know, they all lead to the same place.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a very beautifully encapsulated way of sort of explaining those characters and what they're going through as well. I'm interested to hear both of your thoughts on how these sort of mythologies at the small and grand scale can be a part of the immigrant experience so heavily, both in the UK and the US. I know that, Rebekah, you've had a lot of interactions with a lot of different immigrant experiences in the US as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just very interesting to see. Obviously, in the US, it functions a little bit differently because the experiences that I've had with different immigrant groups are all from the confines of a detention center, which functions very much like a jail. And the organization that I used to work for actually does a lot of work with the detention centers that exist in the UK. Which are very different. Like, for example, you can have a cell phone if you're at a detention center in the UK. You can have your clothes on that you wear. In the US, it's very much you wear a jumpsuit. You are often in the same facility as people who are in a criminal jail. And you know, you don't have a right to an attorney. You have to pay for your phone calls, etc. So I think the stories that I hear from them, I think, are very different than if I were to just speak to them in their communities. And I also think it's important to point out that at least in the US, when I'm talking to people in detention centers, they're also not just people who are immediately crossed a border and were immediately placed in a detention center. A lot of times it's someone who was, you know, picked up during a raid, like, you know, what happens in the novel, a workplace raid. Many times they've lived in the country for years and just have never gotten around to, or have been stuck in the backlog of getting, you know, legalization paperwork done. Or, you know, a lot of times it's someone who overstayed a visa, for example. And I think when I'm hearing stories from people from a detention center, from a jail, it really, I don't know, it's and not from their communities. I feel like it's sort of everyone is coming from the same place. They're all coming from a place where they haven't been able to share their story with anyone because they've just sort of been on their own. And they will just take any experience, any opportunity they can to just share their story with someone. And because of that, you get just these very beautiful stories. And I think a lot of times they'll also identify with a lot of fictional characters in a lot of ways. I visited a woman from Kenya who is in a detention center in New Jersey, and I was talking to her and she was reading a book. They got books delivered to them from the local library, and she was reading a story about a book about a woman who escaped North Korea and, you know, went on to go live her life. And she's like, she told me, she was like, I really related to this woman's story and I hope to get to write my own story one day. We all have stories here that, you know, we all want to tell. And I think, you know, hearing those stories from a detention center really puts the stories in a different perspective. And yeah, and it also just gives people an opportunity to hear stories from people from different countries. You know, you have asylum seekers from India mixing and talking with people, even they don't even speak a common language, but just making friends with, you know, Cuban immigrants and immigrants from all different types of countries. And so I think that unfortunate experience makes the stories all that much richer. But yeah, I just found that perspective, like coming into this book with that perspective of having talked to people who have shared their story to me from a jail-like center, and reading a story like You People, I just found that difference very, very interesting. It's sorry if that made no sense, but in my mind it really did.
Yeah. Rebekah, did you mean that you said what was, I missed that last bit about the difference. You were saying the difference between reading something like You People and the stories
Yeah,
that
I think
are in the detention center itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more so like the stories of immigrants that I've heard, I guess, most recently are because I would get phone calls from people inside detention centers. And so it's not so much people telling me their story about being in their community or working in their community currently. It's more so stories told from the perspective of them currently being in a jail cell for like months. And so I think that has like a different you know, tenor and timbre to the story. And yeah, I was curious just what your research process was like, considering that it was very, you know, realistic. And you know, did you work with organizations, lawyers, nonprofits in the UK to sort of help shape that?
Yeah. Yeah. I spoke to an organization called Freedom from Torture. Um, and I mean, I've always, with each book, I've always used the oral history is quite important to me, actually, which you mentioned, a way of passing down stories. It's very important in my own family. Um, my father was a refugee through when in the partition of India, when India was partitioned and became Pakistan and India, and he he grew up. He sort of came over the border and then grew up in India, and then came to the UK, but not as a refugee, as somebody who came to study and then stay on. But in all of that process and all of that many pronged part, the telling of the stories and the passing down of them orally is very important, even though they get confused. So I think I allocated a story of my dad being smuggled in a suitcase with a bottle of milk on a train in partition. I sort of allocated that to him for ages, but actually, then recently, after years of me thinking it was his story, I found out that it was my mum's. It was from my mum's side of the family and not from his side of the family. But it was still a true story. It's still a true story of the family partition. Um, so it's interesting in that sense that there are a lot of hand-me-down stories that are all true, that have entered my bloodstream. So my process, really, I used to be a documentary maker before I was a novelist, and I still use the same process, which is a mixture of interviews and listening, or what I always thought the writer James Salter put it really well when he said you can get by through most parts of writing with a mixture of close observation or perfect knowledge. So I take perfect knowledge to be when it's happened to you. I mean, this is my reading of that line, close observation and perfect knowledge. So perfect, I mean, it's obviously still imperfect if it's happened to you because there's bias involved, but perfect knowledge, it happened to me, I was there, you know. And then there's everything else. I wasn't there. It's not even going to be imperfect knowledge, it's no knowledge, for which we require research. And for that, the skill that I used in documentary making, which is close observation, or otherwise known as being really nosy and asking really intrusive questions, is what I still use for close observation. So the process for you people was I started talking. Well, first of all, I thought a lot about the restaurant, which was quite a few years ago. It's in the noughts, it's set in the noughts in the book. And so it's in 2003, around then. So it's a long, long time ago. But it's very relevant now. And I was very worried at sort of when I started writing it and I was going back to sort of an age ago, would it still be relevant? You know, unfortunately, it's never been more relevant because obviously, as you say, I'm glad you found it realistic, Rebekah, coming from the work that you do all the time right now. And so I realised that even though the nationality of who we might be talking about as being a dominant refugee community might have changed from it being a Sri Lankan in London at that time, the whole process, the whole concept, the way of coming over, what it means, the displacement, it's the you know, there are huge similarities, and that hasn't changed, or it's just intensified in what's known as the refugee crisis. So the process was that I thought about the restaurant, I thought about the question. Then I talked to organisations like Freedom from Torture and to some asylum lawyers about the actual real granular detail. I guess with my research, I always want to know real details, like that detail I mentioned earlier about the phone going into the huge, big plastic bag. And that came from a journalist who works for The Guardian, who writes on trafficking. And so I talked to her in quite a lot of detail, but my questions aren't necessarily the most obvious questions. They're questions as to they're questions as to the detail of how things go wrong. So they're kind of narrative questions as well as experiential. They're kind of, you know, how do you lose someone and not know how to find them? And what would be the process of finding someone when you don't have resources and you're supposed to be invisible or illegal or keep your head down, or you've been rejected when it comes to asylum in a country? Or what if your partner found asylum somewhere else? What would happen then? If both of you got separated en route, what would happen, you know? And so it's a mixture of that, and then thinking deeply about the stuff that I'm supposed to have perfect knowledge about, which is my own emotional sort of journey of belonging or not belonging in the family, in terms of growing up in Britain, growing up in Wales, and having all of these stories of refugee life that my parents have from childhood and getting by on very little, and then growing into making their lives work as a family. So my father has stories of his own, you know, that the whole family, the extended family, you know, sort of 20 of them, 3 different brothers and their children, all living on 2 chapatis and some yogurt a day in the refugee camps. And those kinds of details are very much rooted in place and time. It's a post-partition story. You know, it's a story of the 40s and then on to the 50s. But it's that kind of detail is something that can then sort of resonate with me and sort of become almost like a photograph. And then I'll think about that a lot, and then plot will emerge from it for the book, which is, I guess, plot is unrelated. But you know, being hungry is important also in the book. Being hungry and being sated is quite important. But the person who's most hungry and who rifles through the bins is actually in Wales, is Nia's sister and Nia's mother. And that's another commonality that her family share with some of the people who come over and who might be struggling to make ends meet, or have a, replace the bulb, things that we take for granted, like replacing the bulb in the ceiling. I read a book called Life in Low Cost Britain by another journalist called Polly Toynbee. And again, it just comes back to those concrete details of experience that I didn't want to do interviews about torture. Freedom of torture advised against that because of the obvious reason that it brings the trauma back if you get too close to traumatic experience and you're not trained to do it. So I had to find these other ways of accessing that emotional truth, I guess.
Thank you. Yes. I think it can be a uh, traumatizing, very traumatizing to the researcher and to the interviewer, as well as re-traumatizing the interviewee. We have a few more minutes here, and I have a question that it's for both of you, that I think is more of a grand scale of history question, I suppose. But so a lot of what's reflected in the book is about uh, human and government caused displacement of people, and how that kind of can unravel a person's sense of place and community and legacy and heritage and all of that. And it got me to thinking, as I was reading the book and also listening to this conversation today, thinking about the large scale global history that we have as humans of displacing each other and then doubly displacing each other again. For example, a few examples that come to mind are not just the refugee crisis that you're referring to, but the border crisis in the United States, and how, Rebecca, you mentioned earlier, some of those people are not just captured crossing the border, but removed from communities that they had been a part of for years. And then I think back in history to, for example, the transatlantic slave trade, where people are forcibly displaced and then double displaced by not being allowed to be citizens of the place that they have been forced to. Uh, and my question is sort of about that grand history, that grand scale history that humans have of displacing each other and then doubly displacing each other by exclusion from community and exclusion from nations, and sort of if you have a sense of like what these trends are moving towards now that there are even more. For example, in the United States and the UK, there's very strong anti-immigrant sentiment, but there's also very strong resistance to that sentiment. And if you have thoughts on that resistance and how it pans out in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I just because you brought up the transatlantic slave trade, I was working on a campaign around a specific group of asylum seekers from Cameroon and who were being deported back to Cameroon. And we somehow, were able to get back in touch with them after they had landed in Cameroon. And the experience they described to us, I think once they like messaged us from someone's phone on WhatsApp, basically, and said that the experience, they felt like they were in the bottom of a slave ship because they were handcuffed the entire time of their journey from where they were detained in Louisiana. They were all like packed in on the specific flight. Some had like spit hoods on their head because they were being, were resisting being placed in handcuffs, and they felt very much like it was history repeating itself. And I felt that was like a really powerful and really depressing story about, history repeating itself with displacement, and it's there's just levels of displacement to that. And even thinking about like detention, like I mentioned before, it's also just levels of displacement of, okay, let's say you were you initially crossed the US Mexico border in the south. Maybe you made a life for yourself in Texas. You lived there for years, and then you were working undocumented. You were arrested during like a workplace raid, for example, and taken into detention. You could be detained anywhere in the United States. It doesn't have to be in that state where you were arrested. So for a lot of times we see people who were transferred from a detention center in Texas to one in New York, where you're again removed from your levels of support, friends you have on the outside who can come visit you in person, your attorney who is in that state, any advocates you have had fighting for your case in that state. So I've definitely have been thinking about those just varying levels of displacement that exist, particularly in the U.S. immigration context, how we're sort of just like shuffling people around, displacing them from the communities that they work so hard to cultivate in the United States after being displaced from their home countries and being moved to another detention center and having to cultivate those relationships yet again. It's something that I've just been thinking about top of mind because, even during the pandemic, there were a number of transfers from detention centers across the country, exposing more people to COVID-19. And it was just really hard for people to cultivate those same relationships, from the many detention centers that they were placed at. So I think, those are just sort of the two examples top of mind, thinking about how history repeats itself with things like deportations, and how that sort of sometimes mirrors, because we're seeing that deportations disproportionately impact Black immigrants in particular from African countries as well as Haiti, but also the ways in which there's just levels of displacement and just shuffling immigrants and treating them like cattle in many ways, just moving them from one place to another and forcing them to cultivate these relationships on their own for survival.
Yeah, that's really a shocking image, Rebecca. So that's I think you've said it all. Really, there's not that much I can add to it. We're living in very extreme times, but I mean, in the UK as well, just like in the US, I mean, there are a lot of problems at the moment around how immigrants are portrayed, the language that is used to portray them in the media. Those who are here for asylum or those who are here for economic reasons, it doesn't matter really. There's definitely a regression, I guess, in terms of the direction in which it feels like things are going, that they're going backwards rather than forwards. But You People is ultimately a positive book. It's a hopeful book because the work that Tuli's doing, or the work that Rebecca is doing, for example, that I'm hearing about today, there are so many people like that, and the impact is very widespread. The reverberations, I would hope that there would be a Tuli or a Rebecca on every on every corner of every block, to do what government is refusing to do, and to make sure that it's not that it's not a hopeless situation, that there is a place to go, like the restaurant in real life.
Yeah, and I forgot to add, answer Shady's last part of the question about where where you see the future going, and I think it is exactly what Nikita was just saying. I think there's a growing movement, I think in the UK and definitely in the US of pushing for decarceration, pushing for this ending of the criminalization of immigration, and sort of trying to prove to the US government that there are support systems that exist. There are people who are willing to open their homes to people who are asylum seekers, and there are these support networks that exist, and we can move towards that collective spirit and take care of one another. And I think that definitely flows into a lot of what the message of You People is. There's a lot of work being done in the US about cultivating enough support for that, and I think there are people doing that work right now, and I think that's why it sort of ties so well into this book.
Thank you both. Those were amazing answers, and I really enjoyed this conversation today. I'm so grateful that we were able to have you two here discussing You People, the book. Before we close out, I'd love to give each of you the opportunity. Firstly, You People is available at Lost City Books, so if you hop on over to our store or hop onto our website, you can order a copy of this book, and I really, really recommend that you do. It's beautifully written and heart-laden is the word that comes to mind. So for those of you watching, if you would like a copy of You People, you can find it at Lost City Books. And I would like to invite the two of you also to let our viewers know where else they can find your work, or how they can engage with you moving forward if they want to seek you out.
Yeah, well, yeah, You People's coming out now with McSweeney's in America, and I'm really excited about that. It's coming out this month, and it's my third book. So the other two books, Gifted and The Village, there's detail about them on my website, which is nikitalalwani.com, the spelling of my name.com. And I'm working on screenplays for all three books at the moment, but You People's the main one that's in development. And I've just had to extend the universe in order to write the treatment for the TV series. So that was interesting. Rebekah?
Yeah, that's exciting. I'm like I mentioned, I edit a site called inequality.org where we just cover a lot of issues relating from all the various aspects of inequality, housing inequality, justice, or climate justice, and immigration as well. I read a lot about undocumented workers and farm workers, all that jazz, restaurant workers. So you can find us at inequality.org. And I'm also on Twitter, I tweet a lot. Rebekah Entralgo on there, just my first and last name. So yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it was a brilliant event.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. And you all have a good evening. Nikita, I know you're probably about to go to sleep. Thank you so much. And have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.